We are taught to grieve the dead. We are rarely taught how to grieve the living, especially when the person you are mourning is yourself. When a doctor delivers a chronic illness diagnosis, the focus immediately shifts to medications, symptom management, and survival. The psychological fallout is often left in the waiting room. Today we are examining a piece published by My Adrenal Life that tackles the profound identity loss following a diagnosis of adrenal insufficiency. The article outlines the fracture between who you were and who you are now. We are going to deconstruct the biological reality of this condition and then take the conversation further, exploring concrete, actionable strategies to navigate the grief of losing your former self.
The psychological shift after a life-altering diagnosis is jarring. Adrenal insufficiency forces a person to transition from living an automatic life to a manual one. Before the diagnosis, the body's internal engine happens behind the scenes. Your body encounters stress, produces cortisol, and you move forward. After the diagnosis, the body's internal engine requires constant, conscious management. This creates an immediate gap between the past self, who possessed freedom and predictability, and the current self, who must calculate the energy cost of every minor task.
To understand the psychological toll, we first have to understand the biological mechanism breaking down. The My Adrenal Life article details 4 types of adrenal insufficiency. The public might occasionally hear about Addison's disease, but the medical reality is far more layered. Break down the mechanical failures happening within the body across these different types.
The failure can happen at several points along what endocrinologists call the HPA axis. This is the communication line between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. Think of it like a heating system in a house. Primary adrenal insufficiency, often called Addison's disease, is a failure of the furnace itself. The adrenal glands are physically damaged, usually by an autoimmune response, infections, or genetic conditions. They simply cannot produce enough cortisol, the hormone responsible for regulating energy, blood pressure, blood sugar, and the stress response. Lifelong hormone replacement is non-negotiable here.
So that is a direct failure of the organ. What happens when the issue lies in the communication network rather than the gland?
That brings us to secondary and tertiary forms. Secondary adrenal insufficiency occurs when the pituitary gland fails to release a hormone called ACTH. Returning to the analogy, the thermostat is broken and fails to tell the furnace to turn on. The adrenal glands might be healthy, but they lack the signal to work. Tertiary adrenal insufficiency moves one step higher up the chain to the hypothalamus, which fails to signal the pituitary. Finally, there is iatrogenic or steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency. When a patient takes external glucocorticoids for a long time to treat other conditions, the body senses the abundance of steroids and shuts down its own natural production. If those medications are stopped too quickly, the system cannot restart fast enough.
The sheer biological impact of losing cortisol explains the physical exhaustion, but the My Adrenal Life article emphasizes a different kind of exhaustion. The piece highlights the emotional burden of comparing your current limitations to your past capabilities. Society often frames receiving a diagnosis as a moment of relief. You finally have an answer to your mystery symptoms. Yet the article argues that relief is quickly overshadowed by grief. Challenge the idea that a diagnosis is purely a step forward.
A diagnosis provides a label, but it also provides a permanent sentence. Prior to knowing what is wrong, a patient often hopes for a cure. They endure the medical gaslighting and the confusion, with the expectation that once the mystery is solved, they will return to their baseline. The diagnosis of a chronic condition, like adrenal insufficiency, shatters that expectation. The relief of validation lasts only until the reality of permanence sets in. The patient realizes the old version of their body is not coming back. They're left holding the grief of a lost future, missing the way their body used to function and confronting the frustration of new, unyielding limits.
This leads to a dangerous paradox. We know that cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone. A healthy body releases extra cortisol to handle physical and emotional stress. A body with adrenal insufficiency cannot. So a patient is thrust into a period of intense emotional mourning over their lost identity. But the act of mourning itself must require a biological response their body can no longer provide.
That is the cruelest irony of this condition. Grieving is an active, demanding biological process. Data from the Addison's Disease Self-Help Group reveals a staggering reality. Emotional stress is reported as the triggering factor for acute adrenal crises in up to 1 in 6 patients. An adrenal crisis is a life-threatening state requiring immediate emergency medical intervention. Bereavement, trauma, and chronic anxiety drain the body's resources. When a healthy person cries, panics, or grieves, their adrenal glands pump out cortisol to help the heart and brain cope with the strain. The patient with adrenal insufficiency experiences the exact same emotional devastation, but lacks the chemical safety net to survive it.
The grief literally becomes a physical threat. If unchecked, emotional stress can precipitate a medical emergency. The standard advice of simply feeling your feelings seems negligent. How does a patient actively navigate this identity loss without pushing their body into a crisis?
The approach must be both medical and psychological. Medically, patients must work closely with their endocrinologists to manage what is known as stress dosing. Clear guidelines from the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases exist for increasing medication during physical stress, like a fever or surgery. However, patients and doctors must also recognize severe emotional stress as a valid biological threat. If a patient is navigating deep trauma or the acute phase of grieving their old life, they may require temporary adjustments to their hydrocortisone or steroid replacements just to maintain physiological stability. You cannot counsel someone out of an adrenal crisis. You have to support the chemistry first.
Once the chemical baseline is secure, the psychological work still remains. The article discusses long-term adaptation. It states that patients do not adapt by going back, but by creating a new way of living. Break down what that creation process actually looks like in practice.
The first actionable step is data gathering. Identity is built on trust in your own body. When that trust is broken, you have to rebuild it through observation. Patients often benefit from meticulous symptom logging in the early stages. By tracking when they feel capable and when they crash, they identified their new baseline. This replaces the chaotic feeling of unpredictability with a sense of structure. They learn the patterns of their new body, which allows them to map out a life that fits within those parameters.
Tracking symptoms sounds clinical. How does a spreadsheet translate into reclaiming a sense of self?
It removes the moral judgment from fatigue. When you do not understand your limits, a crash feels like a personal failure. You blame yourself for not pushing through. When you have the data that shows your cortisol levels naturally dip in the afternoon, the fatigue becomes a biological fact rather than a character flaw. It shifts the internal narrative from "I am weak" to "my body requires a different operational manual." This is the foundation of cognitive reframing.
That operational manual extends to routines. The literature on coping with chronic illness frequently points to sleep hygiene and pacing. Explain why these foundational habits carry disproportionate weight for someone managing a compromised endocrine system.
In a healthy system, cortisol follows a distinct circadian rhythm. It peaks in the morning to wake you up and gradually declines throughout the day, reaching its lowest point at night to allow for sleep. Patients with adrenal insufficiency replicate this rhythm artificially with their medication schedules. Disrupting sleep throws off the delicate balance they work so hard to maintain. Prioritizing consistent sleep routines, managing light exposure, and protecting rest periods are not wellness trends for these individuals, they're critical survival strategies. Pacing operates on the same logic. Instead of spending all their energy at once and enduring a multi-day recovery, patients learn to distribute their tasks. They build rest into their schedules proactively, not just as a reaction to collapse.
There is a tension here between acceptance and resignation. The concept of gentle empowerment from the article touches on this. It gives permission to feel disconnected while also acknowledging that parts of the identity are still shifting. How does a patient find the line between accepting their new limitations and giving up on the things that give their life meaning?
Acceptance is acknowledging the reality of the boundary.
Resignation is refusing to build anything within that boundary. A person who used to find identity in running marathons might feel a profound sense of loss. Resignation says, I can never be an athlete again, so I will do nothing. Adaptation asks, what was the core value I received from marathons? If the value was being outdoors, they might shift to nature photography. If the value was community, they might start coaching or organizing events. The activity changes, but the underlying value is preserved. They adjust their expectations without surrendering their meaning.
You are describing a translation of values. The external expression looks different, but the internal drive remains. Yet, the article is careful to note that this adaptation is not a straight line. Setbacks are inevitable. A patient might feel they have mastered their new routine, only to have a minor infection or a stressful life event completely derail their progress.
Those setbacks often trigger a resurgence of the initial grief. The mourning process for a chronic illness is cyclical. You might grieve your lost independence upon diagnosis, reach a point of acceptance, and then grieve all over again a year later when the illness forces you to cancel a long-awaited trip. The key to moving past the grief is recognizing that a recurrence of sadness is not a regression in your coping skills. It is simply a reaction to a new loss. The tools you built, the pacing, the communication with doctors, the reframing of productivity are still there. You just have to apply them to the new obstacle.
The framework of identity evolution provides a compelling lens. We view identity as a fixed monument we build in our 20s and 30s. When illness strikes, it feels like the monument is destroyed. The reality is that identity is more like a river. The terrain changes, the borders shift, and the water has to find a new path around the obstruction. The water is still there. It just moves differently.
That captures the closing reassurance of the piece perfectly. Losing a sense of who you were feels entirely disorienting. It strips away the comforts of familiarity, but it does not mean you have lost your core essence. You are navigating a drastically different set of circumstances, carrying a heavier cognitive and physical load than most people will ever understand. Some people find that this process, while brutal, forces them to discover new priorities and strengths they would never have accessed otherwise. Both the grief for the old self and the pride in the new self can coexist.
We often demand a tidy resolution to stories of illness, forcing a narrative of triumph over adversity. The truth of living with a condition like adrenal insufficiency resists that simplicity. It requires daily, silent management of both the physical machinery and the psychological weight. Acknowledging that complexity is the necessary first step toward genuine adaptation. If this conversation brought some clarity to your day, send the link to a friend who appreciates a deep dive into the human experience.